Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out for you. You support me, you support me. Yep, you support me and I support me. I'm not tired. Let's try this again, boys and girls, because I am apparently out at the end of my data. Give me just a minute. Let's try this again. Ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me and I support you. This shout out is for our friend, Come Heither with Heather, which I love that name. It's very entertaining. Miss Heather lives, I believe, in Australia, if I remember correctly. Says, as a child, I always enjoyed exploring abandoned buildings and interesting places. Whether homes, hospitals, factories, I explore it all. We're working on exploring. We've got an exploration coming up at an old asylum. We're babies and chickens about it, so you'll enjoy laughing at us, I'm sure. Please check Heather out. She's very sportive, very fun, very entertaining videos. Like, share, comment to let her know that we sent you by. And don't forget to have a good day. Goodbye. Okay, Mr. Joseph, what do you have to say?
Well, since we dwell in South Dakota, and primarily in western South Dakota, I wanted to shed a little bit of light on the original Americans who lived here, Turtle Island, depending on who you talk to. The primary thing that I wanted to touch base on a little bit is how we've gotten to this stage in time, and how the Native American presence was here long before we ever were.
As of anywhere, or everywhere, I should say.
The interesting part of it, as they like to refer to, the Lakota were originally part of a group of 7 council fires, known as the Oseti-Sakowin, made up of 7 bands. So think of it as a region, and then think of smaller states as part of one region. There were 4 Dakota, 2 Nakota, and 1 Lakota. These were often referred to the 3 tribes of the Sioux. Now, Lakota Sioux were broken down into 7 individual groups, referred to as the Teton. You had the Brule Sikanju, you had the Hunkpapa, the Minikuzu, Blackfeet, not to be confused with the separate Blackfeet tribe, the Sanzar, or known as Without Bows, the 2 Boilings, or 2 Cattle, and the Oglala, which is pretty close to here, known as the Dust Scatterers. The second group, the Dakota Sioux, referred to as the Santee, with 4 bands. This was the Mitawakon, the Wapukon, the Sisakon, and the Wapatokon. And then, of course, the Nakota, which were also known as the Yankton, had 2 bands, referred to as the Dwellers at the End, or Little Dwellers at the End. Now, first recorded contact that any of the Dakota had with white men was back in 1640 by the Jesuits in an area in present-day Wisconsin where they had dwelt for many generations. The nearby Chippewa called them the Oseti-Sakowin, meaning little or treacherous snakes. Thanks, guys. The French later corrupted the term to Nadawin Sioux, which later the English translated shortly to Sioux. Now, in 1680, the Lakota, Tuasape extended family, were living further west on the upper Mississippi and central Minnesota, but continuing wars between the eastern tribes over the fur trade had driven the Chippewa westward into the area as well. The Chippewa were well armed by the French and gradually forced the Oseti-Sakowin westward out of the forest and lake range and onto the Great Plains west of the Mississippi. This is where the Lakota basically had to learn to go from being farmers into more of a nomadic people. By 1750, the Lakota...
Wasn't the other way around? Weren't they nomadic and then farming?
No, they were farmers first.
That's weird. Okay, yeah. Continue. I'm sorry.
No problem. In 1750, the Lakota, mostly the Oglala and Brule bands, had moved into the southeastern area of what is present-day South Dakota near the Missouri River. Here, they encountered the Arikara and were attacked, and eventually were able to push them out of the area, interestingly enough, by the addition of 2 things, horses and rifles. During the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Lakota came to control the lands around the Black Hills and on the northern plains, by the eviction of the Cheyenne and Crow tribes, areas that would later become western South Dakota, eastern Montana, northern Wyoming, and northern Nebraska. Now, our next part of this happy little exchange, in 1775 and 1776, while we were out having the American Revolution, an Oglala war party traveling west from the Missouri area came to the Black Hills. The Black Hills at that time were occupied by the Cheyenne, along with the Kiowa and the Crow. But by 1794, after constant warfare, the Oglala and Brule controlled the Black Hills, allowing the Cheyenne to remain in the area as allies while driving away the other tribes. Indians traded with almost exclusively with the French until about 1817, when American traders began to compete for the buffalo fur business. By 1825, the U.S. sewed up the trade business with a treaty with Oglala branch of the Teton, and in separate treaties with other tribes, and centered around the American Fur Company trading post in eastern Wyoming. Well, 1840 came along, an increasing flow of immigrants to Oregon and California brought cholera, smallpox, and measles to the Indians, as well as accelerated buffalo hunting. This caused hostility and some of the attacks against the immigrants and traders. In 1849, the U.S. military took over the fur trading post and renamed it Fort Laramie. This fort will become key later on. In 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty, a series of treaties with several tribes, was supposed to guarantee peace between the U.S. and many of the Indian tribes in a huge area east of the Rocky Mountains, all the way to Minnesota, north of the Texas-New Mexico lines. The Lakota were called the Dakota in the 1851 treaty. The Cheyenne, Crow, Arapaho, and other tribes were also involved in this agreement and had individual territories assigned to them. Now, an 1851 treaty was only a temporary pause in the ongoing conflict between the Indian tribes and continued.
Sorry, continue. I had a phone call come through. It disconnected the recording.
Throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s, especially in Montana, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana, the Crow had been assigned to the Powder River Basin, which is over in Wyoming, and the Bighorn Mountain area in the 1851 treaty, but from 1851 to 1862, the Lakota, in alliance with the Northern Cheyenne, conducted annual campaigns against the Crow, eventually cutting off their supplies. The Crow were driven out of Wyoming and up into Montana, and eventually out of the eastern Montana area also, because of intertribal competition for the shrinking hunting grounds for the buffalo. Some of these Indians thought that there should be no travel through their lands and would attack any incursions, including civilian wagon trains heading for Oregon, which were permitted by the 1851 treaty. This led to the U.S. providing military escorts to immigrants traveling to Oregon through the Powder River Basin from the Black Hills on the east to the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming on the west, and resulted in battles between Indians, the U.S. military, and the immigrants. Often American civilians turned north in central Wyoming towards the gold fields in Montana. This was a clear violation of the 1851 treaty as understood by the Indians, although such inroads were allowed, as understood by the U.S. By written treaty, Article 2, the Lakota and Cheyenne gathered their forces in March and in 1865 of April for attacks against every white settlement, steamboats, stagecoach, and immigrant wagon trains, civilians as well as military personnel that invaded their territory. The U.S. government and military responded with more troops. Now, superficial attempts were made by the U.S. government to get Indians to sign another treaty in 1865. Meanwhile, moving in more troops to build more forts. The main chiefs, including Red Cloud, would have nothing to do with it. Finally, in 1866 to 1868...
Uh-oh.
Jill sneezed. Red Cloud...
Really? I don't remember that in the history books.
Everywhere. Several allied tribes, as well as all-out war against the U.S. military, known as Red Cloud's War, to close the Bozeman Trail that passed through the buffalo hunting grounds in the Bighorn Territory from northeast Wyoming into Montana. The 1866 Fetterman Massacre was part of this war, where 80 troops were lured out of Fort Phil Kearny to chase a handful of Indians. The Indians, under Red Cloud's strategy and Crazy Horse's leadership, trapped Captain Fetterman and wiped out the entire force. The Indians called it the Battle of the 100 Slain. Under Red Cloud, the Indians isolated the force and harassed supply columns, making it impossible for the U.S. military to maintain a presence. The U.S. acknowledged defeat and sued for peace. This is the only time the Indian leaders totally defeated the United States in a war.
Woo.
The result from this is a well-known treaty known as the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, in which the U.S. withdrew its military forces from the Black Hills and Bighorn Territory. It created the Great Sioux Reservation, on which the U.S. hoped the majority of Indians would eventually settle and take up agriculture with American aid. The treaty also affirmed that the Black Hills was Sioux land and that the Sioux had hunting rights, but not permanent resident rights, in the areas north of the Platte River, east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains, on seceded Indian territory. Crazy Horse would not sign this treaty. He and other Indians believed they had a right to reside in the hunting areas, as had been their tradition for many years. Now, the wording of the treaty left out the rights of the U.S. military, incursions, and U.S. governmental railroad surveys. Article 2 of the treaty spelled out the Great Sioux Reservation territorial boundaries, including the Black Hills, and indicated it was set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians herein named. It further states the United States now solemnly agrees that no persons except those herein designated and authorized to do so, and except such officers, agents, employees of the government as may be authorized to enter onto Indian reservations in discharge of duties enjoined by law, shall ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in the territory described in this article. While seeming to protect the Lakota from incursions on the reservation by Americans, the wording was such that military incursions ordered by Washington could be permitted. This led to a large 1874 Custer expedition. We all remember that history lesson.
Woo, Custer's failure.
Into the Black Hills that set up a large fort to protect future surveys and construction. This expedition discovered gold and advertised it, leading to the invasion of the Black Hills by prospectors and miners.
Ah, the gold rush.
Yes. Red Cloud and Spotted Tail personally negotiated with Ulysses S. Grant in 1870 in Washington, D.C. There were misunderstandings of the terms of the Treaty of 1868. The U.S. wanted the main Indian agency on the Missouri River, which Red Cloud had never agreed to, even though it was written treaty. Spotted Tail had moved the rule to the Missouri, but Red Cloud refused to move his people. Interpreters of the 1868 were blamed. Red Cloud insisted that the Powder River country in Wyoming was part of the Sioux land, not just the formal Sioux reservation in South Dakota, and President Grant and his Secretary of the Interior changed their interpretation of the treaty to match that of Red Cloud. It was reaffirmed by the Sioux and other tribes that could live on the Powder River country, as well as hunt on it. This is another victory for Red Cloud that lasted about 3 years. In August of 1873, Red Cloud and the Spotted Tail agencies were moved into the White River in northwest Nebraska, next to Fort Robinson, to live mostly on government rations. Although when rations were scarce, some would leave the agencies and hunt in the unceded territory. The settlers and land developers that wanted those Indians settled in the Powder River Basin to move out. In spite of President Grant's promise in 1870, the government had kept up pressure by delaying rations until they finally moved. Red Cloud was actually away from his agency with Oglala buffalo hunting parties when this move took place. He later protested and threatened war. The roving bands of thousands of younger warriors and their families following Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull remained in the Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana territories that had been agreed as Sioux land and Cheyenne and Arapaho hunting lands. Now, next stage. From there, as we
That's just train of thought.
well, superficial attempts on the government to get the Indians to sign another treaty, meanwhile moving more troops to build forts. The main chiefs, including Red Cloud, would have nothing to do with it. Now, when they didn't sign these treaties, they started running into problems where, the forces would come out, they would do battle, and then they would try to make a run back to the reservations to, basically, oh, we're safe, we're perfectly good. Sometimes the bands of Native Americans would take and make runs up to Canada. A good example of this is when Custer wound up getting wiped out after the Battle of Little Bighorn. some of those forces actually did retreat up into Canada. Their only problem that they ran into there was that once they got into Canada, the Canadians wouldn't offer them any reservation land. They basically said, well, you're not originally from here, you know, you can stay here, but you're not going to get any free property to set up your own reservation. We already have reservations for our own tribes. Now, from that point going forward, they also ran into the problem that, you know, as more lands were being settled, moving, you know, east to west, looking at a map of South Dakota, they actually started dividing up western South Dakota into 3 partitions. The first part was moved into, and they had a specific term for it. Give me 1 second while I get my second book up.
He's lost it, folks. Maybe I should pause it here. Go.
All right. Well, as the way western South Dakota was basically partitioned off, opening up land to, you know, settlers, immigrants, and so forth. Originally, when you think of the entire western part of South Dakota, from the Missouri River to the Wyoming border, this was all supposed to be set aside as the Great Sioux Reservation. There were a couple extra segments in Wyoming, but we're going to deal with the South Dakota piece first of all. Now, the first opening that they had dealt with an area that basically was between the Cheyenne River and White River. It's a big piece from basically Pierre all the way back to the Cheyenne River. It was opened up. Now, some of the settlement parts were already reservationed. The Lower Brule had their reservation on the western side of the Missouri River. The Crow Creek people had their reservation on the eastern side of the river. The Yankton were already set up as well. The Santee were down to Nebraska. Now, Lake Traverse had their people all the way over by what is modern day Watertown, northeastern part of the state. Well, when they made the second big partition piece, they wound up dividing up the sections that they already had. Cheyenne River and Standing Rock were in the northern central part of South Dakota. Pine Ridge and Rosebud were the lower 2 halves of the state, and they were pretty much already divided up that way by the partition agreement. Well, the second partition agreement that happened was what was known as the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act went through, and it was based on the idea that what would happen is that every person on the tribe would be counted for. You'd get an allotment, and then they would get X number of acres, kind of like immigrants would. 160 acres, depending on the people. And so what the government would be able to do is they would say, okay, you have your land. They would give everybody in that particular area that much land. But then they opened up a couple of the other counties that were originally, you know, Rosebud or Pine Ridge. And if there was any land that was left over, those lands would then be given to immigrants to settle, to try to farm, to use for rangeland, whatever. It was actually kind of, to be honest with you, kind of dirty, because what wound up happening is where Rosebud originally had land going all the way from Rosebud County to the Missouri River, a good 2/3 of their land is now, well, it almost looks like a case of measles if you ever look at a federal map, because you might have this little acre, this little square of land here, the Native American. The next 3 over can belong to white people. Another one that's Native American, 2 more might be white people. And so it kind of scattered. Now, in today's modern age, they are trying to find ways to fix that out, where they're trying to trust land properties within those counties. One of them is in a county that has the capital of Martin. That's Millette County. And it's about, right now, a 50-50 mix. Half of it is trust land that is belonged by, in this case, the Lakota. And then Millette County, like I was saying, their second county is dealing with the same effect, dealing with Todd County. And so, they're working to slowly repopulate those counties with all Native American lands. Now, the one aspect that was what I felt was probably the worst deal possible, there was one that was set up that basically led to the starvation of Native Americans. And it came along, and I think it was 1877, and they referred to it as the Take It or Leave It Act. Because they basically told the Native Americans, you will lose everything in the Black Hills, everything in western South Dakota, and you have no choice, but you will be forced back onto the reservations. It led to a lot of people who were openly protesting this, but in the long run, they, were forced to settle back down onto the reservations. A lot of immigrants were moving into the area. Several major towns were being set up and built, primarily to, support active mining, farming, and ranching operations. The railroads were coming in to bring in even more both equipment and people, and basically a race of people were forced to give up their hunting and basically their livelihoods to try to become subsistence farmers, something that they hadn't done in over 200 years. So obviously it, for some people, it didn't work very well.
I still say that they probably would have had to anyway. They would have run out of things to hunt even if we hadn't come along. Probably would have taken a little bit longer, yeah. But...
The one thing also that's kind of crazy I was reading about with that Scotty Phillip book. By the way, for those of you who want to check out a good read, find something on Scotty Phillip. He's one of the guys that was kind of instrumental in saving the bison herds in the northern plains. One of the things that they did that was both kind of extremely wasteful is they would have trainloads of, for the lack of a better word, tourists who would go out and actively gun down bison by the railroad tracks and then just leave them out there to rot. And the idea for the military is that, well, if we could starve the Native Americans into accepting living on the reservations, then they could bring in food for them. But at the same time, Scotty Phillip was kind of a cool guy. He started out, first he tried to mine gold. That didn't work. Then he tried to be a military scout, which didn't work out too well either. Then he became kind of a courier. But then he settled in kind of the central part of South Dakota, and he started doing animal research on these bison and tried to find ways to make them a more hardy, survivable species. And now you can see his handiwork all over South Dakota, because like down in Custer State Park, every year they have the Buffalo Roundup. Kind of awesome to see the effects. I think we've got that video that we recorded shooting buffalo down there in Custer State Park when we took that trip.
I don't think it's come up yet.
Not yet, but it will in the future. There's this one video we've got with this huge amount of buffalo, and I mean these things are huge. As
fluffy cows.
Fluffy cows. Don't recommend getting out of the car.
Want to see the stupidity of humans? Look up buffalo encounters in South Dakota.
Not smart. But as things have gone along, the South Dakota still has its 9 tribes, and they all have their individual governments. They are working to make some parts of it better, leasing out property for ranching. One of these times I'll tell the story about the Badlands bombing range, which our military decided to take some land over from the Native Americans and used it to practice for World War II bombing runs. And
Hey, the Badlands is a good place to practice bombs.
oh yeah, except where people were farming.
You can't really farm in the Badlands.
Apparently
You could probably try.
They were trying, and apparently some places were a little successful. Although I don't think I'd want to go to that church that was set up in the bombing range.
What?
That would not be smart.
Seems like a very holy church.
Very holy. You can see right through the roof.
Hee hee hee.
But yeah, later on, I'll take and give you guys more tidbits about the Badlands. We are going to take and do a drive-through of the Badlands when they have a no-fee day coming up in September, so you guys can watch for that.
This will probably means it'll be posted in November or
sometime.
December.
Yeah. But this is Joe, the Bearded Historian, shedding a little light for you guys, and we'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.